Amen. Well, have you ever come across one of those unnecessary warning labels on a product? You know, I remember I got one of those sunshades for my car to protect it from the sun so it doesn't get too hot in the summertime, and print on the back, do not drive with sunshade in place. Or sometimes on an iron, you know, for your clothes, it says, warning, do not iron clothes while you're wearing them. My favorite one is any of these prescription ads you see on TV. One of the things they say at the end of the ad is, if you are allergic to, you know, XYZ drug, do not take XYZ drug. It's like, you think? Seems unnecessary to give some of these warnings that are out there. And we kind of make fun of it, but I mean, they're doing it for a reason, right? Somebody had to do that at some point. And when I think of these unnecessary warnings, these what to me seem pointless, obvious warnings, it's easy to step away and think that, well, I don't need that kind of warning. And it's easy for me to bring that attitude to the passage that we're looking at this morning, Proverbs chapters 1 through 9. Just a reminder, next week we are going to be back in our series on the life of David. Pastor Paul is going to be preaching from 2 Samuel chapter 11, so we look forward to that. But we're going to continue today with the two-part diversion into the prologue of Proverbs, the first 9 chapters of the book of Proverbs. Last week we talked about how Proverbs, although the bulk of it is these proverbial sayings of wisdom that we're most familiar with, the first 9 chapters are a lengthy series of poems that serve as a prologue, laying out the value of wisdom and the danger of folly. Basically, almost a third of the book of Proverbs is written primarily for the purpose of saying, hey, don't be foolish, be wise. And I think about that, and my initial response is, you know, that's kind of like telling me not to take the prescription drug if I'm allergic to it, right? Like, who do you know that says, oh, really? I thought I should be foolish instead of wise. And even if there are some people out there, I'm reading the book of Proverbs, right? Obviously, I know I'm supposed to be wise instead of foolish. Otherwise, I wouldn't be reading this stuff. So doesn't it seem like overkill a little bit that there are 9 chapters dedicated to urging us to avoid folly and pursue wisdom? There must be a reason for that, right? There must be a reason that folly, even to those who seek wisdom enough to open up the book of Proverbs and read it, that folly is in some way appealing. So that's the question we want to try and answer today. What is the appeal of folly, and how do we avoid folly's appeal? There's a few things that I think we can source out as we look at the book of Proverbs. And again, 9 chapters. Obviously, we don't have time this morning to go verse by verse through all 9. We're going to be skipping around a little bit, drawing from the prologue of Proverbs and a few other places of Scripture to illustrate these principles that this prologue serves to set out before us. That there is a real danger of falling into the path of folly. And what is the source of that danger? The first thing I think we need to recognize about folly is that for the most part, folly promises to meet a legitimate desire in an illegitimate way. Sometimes we think that folly is just about doing stupid things for stupid reasons. But the fact is, for the most part, when you look at the path of folly or the path of sin, they're almost synonymous in the book of Proverbs. When you look at the path of folly or the path of sin, it is almost always an attempt to meet a legitimate desire in an illegitimate way. The contrast to Lady Wisdom, who we looked at last week and saw as a personification of God's wisdom, an attribute of God himself, the foil to her in the prologue of Proverbs is the wayward wife, the adulterous woman, the Lady Folly. She goes by many names. It's the same character. The last words that she speaks in this section, in the prologue of Proverbs, can be found in verse 17 of Proverbs chapter 9. And this is what she says. She says, stolen water is sweet, and bread eaten in secret is pleasant. Just as Lady Folly herself stands in for all sorts of foolishness, all kinds of sinful pursuits, here the water and the bread stand in for anything that one might be pursuing on the path of folly. But notice, what are the chosen elements to represent those? Water and bread. Is it wrong to want water? Is it wrong to desire to eat bread? Of course not. These are legitimate desires. These are desires that God wants to meet in our lives. But what's the problem? She says, stolen water is sweet. Bread eaten in secret, the implication being that it's ill-gotten or there's something wrong about the way you got your bread. That is the problem. Legitimate desires met in an illegitimate way. The fact is, when we are tempted to sin, we are almost always seeking to gratify a legitimate desire. Even if the thing that we're thinking about doing is clearly illegitimate, clearly sinful, clearly foolish, it is almost always an underlying legitimate desire that can be met legitimately if we do things God's way and trust Him. The wise father who narrates the prologue, who is the source of wisdom in the prologue of Proverbs, offers the chance for us to have our desires met legitimately. Here again, in contrast to the temptation of Lady Folly, he says in Proverbs chapter 5, verses 15 to 18, he says the following: "Drink water from your own cistern and fresh water from your own well. Should your springs be dispersed abroad, streams of water in the streets, let them be yours alone and not for strangers with you. Let your fountain be blessed and rejoice in the wife of your youth." Those very same things that Lady Folly offers in an illegitimate way, things that we're told lead to death, those very same desires can be met in a legitimate way according to God's plan. Now, this is where I have to remind you again, as we spoke last week, the book of Proverbs lays out the world as it was designed to be, as it should be. We have to acknowledge the reality that in a sinful, broken world, sometimes doing things God's way doesn't always meet our legitimate desires in a way that is satisfying, at least not in the short term. But on the whole, generally speaking, those desires, whether it be a desire for acceptance, a desire for love, a desire for our physical needs to be met, a desire for fellowship and relationships with fellow human beings, those core desires that drive us so often to folly, drive us to sin, can be met legitimately if we do it in God's way and in God's timing. But the way of folly offers us shortcuts, offers us an alluring temptation to do things in a different way. When you find yourself tempted by folly, and you know that it goes outside of God's way of doing things, I found for me a helpful question to ask is, what is the legitimate desire that I'm being tempted to meet here? Is it a desire for significance? Do I want to look good in front of people? Well, that desire for significance can be met more completely and in a God-honoring way by acknowledging the significance that I have as a child of God, as a follower of Jesus, as a member of His family. Maybe you have a desire to be generous, to provide for your family, and you're tempted to fulfill that by seeking dishonest gain, acquiring resources for yourself in a way that doesn't honor God. God wants you to meet that desire by trusting Him to provide, recognizing that He is the ultimate one who provides for your loved ones, often through you, but it doesn't have to be through you. Whatever it is that we're tempted to do, if we can recognize the legitimate desire, we can seek the godly way of trusting God to provide for that desire. The second thing we need to understand about the way of folly is that the way of folly has a tendency to capture our imagination. Look at chapter 5, verses 3 through 5. These are the words of Lady Folly, the words of the adulteress, according to the wise father who's telling us how she would speak to the simple person. It says, "For the lips of an adulteress drip honey, and smoother than oil is her speech. but in the end she is bitter as wormwood, sharp as a two-edged sword. Her feet go down to death, her steps take hold of Sheol. Sheol is the Hebrew word for the grave or the underworld. The danger of folly is, on the surface, it looks attractive. On the surface, it looks enticing. We don't see where it leads. It leads to death. Now, in the book of Proverbs, as in much of the scriptures, that term death has a dual meaning. It absolutely refers to physical death in the sense that pursuing this way of life often leads to a premature physical death. But underlying that, more importantly and more consistently, is spiritual death. The way of folly, departing from God's way of doing things, always leads to spiritual death. It always separates us from God. We can even think back to the story of Adam and Eve. God says if they ate of the tree of knowing good and bad for themselves, that they would, on the day they ate of it, he said, they would die. Now, they ate of that tree. They did not physically die that day. Physical death followed later. But what preceded that, what occurred immediately, was a spiritual death, a separation between them and their Creator. The way of folly separates us. But it presents itself as attractive. It presents itself as enticing. And the danger is that as we fixate on the surface, we become enamored. It can capture our hearts. It can capture our imaginations. It can capture our minds. We looked at chapter 8 in some detail last week, looking at Lady Wisdom, the personification of God's wisdom. Chapter 7 is the mirror image of that. It's an allegory for the way of folly, for Lady Folly. We don't have time to look at that chapter in detail today, but if you read it, you will see the appeal of folly in capturing the young man's imagination, in the vivid descriptions, trying to entice him with this appeal, this surface appeal. And here's the thing. This is why this is dangerous. Because even if you know that it leads to death, the fact is, once your heart and mind and imagination are captivated by something, you're in danger. Think about the advertising that you experience. If you're watching television and an ad comes on, or the internet or wherever, what percentage of those ads are appealing to your logic and reason? There's a few out there, right? But for the most part, what are they appealing to, those guys on Madison Avenue? They're trying to capture your imagination. They're painting a picture. They're trying to draw you in. And it's because they're smart and they know that our decisions primarily are driven not by logic and reason, but whatever has captured our heart, whatever has captured our imagination. See, even if you know that folly is folly, if you stare at it long enough, if you think about it long enough, there is a danger of it capturing your heart and mind. This is why in the New Testament we're told to resist the devil, but we're never told to resist temptation. What are we told to do with regard to temptation? Flee. Don't look at it. Don't think about it. Because the longer we look, the more we think, the more we are in danger of having our hearts and minds captured by the way of folly. So what do? We have to redirect our hearts and minds, don't we? This is why worship is so important. Sometimes we think that God commands us to worship because, I don't know, he needs an ego boost or something. But that's not what it's about. The reason we're commanded to worship is because it is critical for us to allow the God of the universe to capture our hearts and minds. When we come before the Lord in worship, when we fix our gaze on him, when we think about his beauty and his glory, we are giving our hearts and minds and imaginations to God. That's where it belongs. But folly wants to distract us. Folly wants us to pull our attention away from God, that it can capture our hearts and minds with the way of folly. One other truth we need to keep in mind when we consider the appeal of the way of folly, and that is that folly tells us that we are already wise and we can be independent. This is a theme we looked at a little bit last week. It's all through the book of Proverbs. If you look at Proverbs 12:15, if you look at Proverbs 26:12, it talks about how the foolish person considers themselves wise, does not think that they need wisdom or instruction. Or even in the prologue, as we looked at last week, Proverbs 3:5-7 says, trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your paths straight. Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and turn away from evil. The fool doesn't think he's a fool. The fool thinks he's already wise. And the flip side of the coin is the wise man doesn't think that he's already wise. He knows that he is still lacking wisdom. And although wisdom and folly are presented as the two alternatives throughout the book of Proverbs, and it can give us the impression that there's a dichotomy, that either you're a wise one or you're a foolish one, and never the twain shall meet. The reality is, when we read carefully, that there is a constant progression toward either wisdom or folly. It's not a static state. Proverbs 4:7 from our prologue here says, the beginning of wisdom is acquire wisdom, and with all your acquiring, get understanding. Before you can become wise, you have to want to be wise. And the more you seek wisdom, the more wise you will become. But as soon as you stop wanting to become wise, you start down the road of folly. Or if we look at verse 9 of chapter 9, it tells us, give instruction to the wise man, and he will be still wiser. Teach the righteous man, and he will increase his learning. It is a constant progression toward wisdom. You're never done. And the moment you think you're done, the moment you think you're wise and you've got the answer, you are now on the road to folly. But that's appealing, isn't it? Don't we all want to think that eventually we'll get to the place where we've got the answers and we don't have to humble ourselves and learn anymore? Don't we all want to be in the place where we can be the one to give the advice, to give the answers, to issue the judgments, rather than submitting ourselves to other people as instruments of God in our lives? That's the appeal of folly. But if we want to pursue the path of wisdom, that means we have to continually to seek wisdom in dependence on God. When we think of the threefold appeal of wisdom, the desire to meet, the temptation to meet legitimate desires in illegitimate ways, the fact that it captures our imagination, and the fact that it appeals to our vanity, the desire to be independent from God and declare ourselves wise, we see this mirrored in sin all through the Bible. Even if we go back to the original sin, we might call the original sin in Genesis chapter 3 the original act of folly. Well, we don't have time to look at the whole story this morning. Hopefully it's familiar to you. God has planted the garden. He's put the man and the woman, Adam and Eve, in the garden. He's given them every tree to eat from except for one tree called the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, or I prefer the translation, the knowledge of good and bad. It represents the ability to choose for themselves what is good for them and what is bad for them. And the serpent tempts them to defy God's commandment and eat of it. We pick up the story in Genesis 3, verses 4-6. It says this, it says, the serpent said to the woman, you surely will not die. He wants to hide the ultimate consequence of that sin, just as the Lady Folly hides where her way leads. He says, for God knows that in the day you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil, or knowing good from bad. And this is the kicker, verse 6. Look at this. When the woman saw that the tree was good for food, legitimate desire, met in an illegitimate way. The tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes. She'd been looking at that tree for a while. That tree had a hook in her heart. She'd been thinking about it. and that the tree was desirable to make one wise. And again, the term here is to make one wise, but this is the opposite of the wisdom of Proverbs, isn't it? This is wisdom standing apart from God, to be like God, to decide for myself without having to go to God or submit to God or humble myself before God. She wanted to be wise in her own eyes. When she saw those three things, she took from its fruit and ate, and she gave also to her husband with her, and he ate. The path of folly is the path of sin. The appeal of folly is the appeal of sin. It is an appeal to do things without God, to meet my legitimate desires without doing it God's way, to allow my heart and mind to be captured not by the creator of the universe, but by the things I see around me, and to make decisions for myself as to what is going to be good and bad for me and the people I love. The book of Proverbs, the bulk of it was written by Solomon. Solomon, the son of David, the wisest man that ever lived. But I do think it's worth noting that the final form of the book of Proverbs that we have was composed later, after Solomon's story was well established and well known. Chapters 10 through 24 were written down by Solomon. Chapter 25 through 29 were written later. We're told in 25 verse 1 it was transcribed. They're the Proverbs of Solomon, transcribed under the reign of Hezekiah, which is over 100 years later. So these are things that were passed on verbally, orally, in the oral tradition that were written down later to be included in this collection of wisdom. And then chapters 30 and 31 were written by two other guys we don't know a lot about, Agur and Lemuel. And then there's some debate as to who wrote the prologue. A lot of people say it was Solomon. A lot of people think maybe somebody else. But either way, when it was all put together, the guys who put it together were doing it after Solomon's life and reign was over and well established and recorded in the book of Kings. The books of the Kings, 1st and 2nd Kings in our Bible. And so they knew the story of Solomon, and they knew that their readers knew the story of Solomon. And we think of Solomon as the wisest man who ever lived, and he was, and his wisdom is highlighted here. But there had to be in the back of the minds of the original readers, yeah, but what happened with Solomon? Do you remember what happened with Solomon? Starts out pretty good. In 1 Kings chapter 3, we read in verse 5 that God comes to Solomon after he's been made king. It says, verse 5, it says, in Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream at night, and God said, ask what you wish me to give you. A blank check. Ask me for anything you want, Solomon. And Solomon's answer pleases the God. He thanks God for who he is and for what he's done and talks about his role and everything. But he cuts to the chase finally in verse 9. This is what Solomon says in 1 Kings 3:9. He says, so give your servant an understanding heart to judge your people, to discern between good and evil, or good and bad. For who is able to judge this great people of yours? He says, I am not wise. I need your wisdom. I cannot choose what is good and what is bad. I don't know how to rule. Give me wisdom. And God says, oh, good answer, Solomon. He says, that's such a good answer. I'm not only going to give you more wisdom than anybody else, I'm also going to make you rich and successful and bless everything you do. And things go pretty good for a while. And Solomon starts building this great kingdom. And as you read the story of Solomon, there's not a lot of explicit critique, but you start to notice some things. He's starting to do the things that successful kings do. He marries a lot of women from other nations, which is what kings did. That was considered the wise thing to do. It's how you made alliances and stayed out of wars and helped your kingdom be prosperous and successful. He built up his army. He got the best horses from Egypt to pull chariots, which were the super weapon of the day, so that his people could be safe and secure. Makes sense, right? And he undertakes these huge building projects. He builds a temple for the Lord. He builds a palace for himself. He builds up the fleet of the navy of the people of Israel. He builds up the nation. And of course, to do it, you gotta get your labor from somewhere. So he uses forced labor, but he doesn't do it to the Israelites. He uses all the foreigners that have come in or they've been defeated in battle to do this forced labor. It all seems like it makes sense until you realize that he is violating the explicit commandments of God in Deuteronomy chapter 17, verses 14 through 20. We don't have time to look there now. But God explicitly says there, future kings, don't marry many wives. Don't acquire large amounts of gold and silver. Don't build up your army and have lots of horses. And he specifically says, don't get horses from Egypt. And the writer of 1 Kings says, Solomon went and got horses from Egypt. And it says, don't mistreat the foreigners among you. Remember, Pharaoh made you slaves in Egypt. Pharaoh, the wicked king, forced the foreigner Israelites to do his building projects. Now Solomon, who's supposed to be the wise, godly king, is forcing the foreigners to do his building projects as slave labor. It's not explicit in the story of Solomon, but clearly he has wandered from the path of wisdom onto the path of folly. How does that happen? Well, I think things were going pretty good. He was a good king. He was the wisest man in the kingdom, after all. So he started doing things that made sense to him. Legitimate desire, he wants to build up his nation. He wants his nation to prosper. He wants to be a successful king. Pursuing it apart from God's commandments. Then what happens? 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 3. He, that Solomon, had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned his heart away. His heart is captured. His imagination is captured by these foreign women and their foreign gods, and he slips into the sin of idolatry. Legitimate desire met in an illegitimate way. He thinks he's wise. He is wise. But he stops seeking God's guidance and following God's commandments in pursuing that legitimate desire. And his heart is ultimately captured, and he slips into idolatry. And we read in verses 9 and 10, now the Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart was turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice, and had commanded him concerning this thing, that he should not go after other gods. But he did not observe what the Lord had commanded. The wisest man in the world became, in some sense, the greatest fool in the world. And when Proverbs is put together, the final editor who gives us this inspired version of Proverbs knew that. And he starts by saying, hey, this is the wisdom of Solomon. And then he spends 9 chapters beating it into our heads that we have to continue to pursue wisdom and avoid folly. And I think he's counting on us thinking this: if it could happen to Solomon, it could happen to me. If it could happen to Solomon, it could happen to me. It seems like an obvious choice. Of course I want wisdom instead of folly. Of course I'm pursuing wisdom. That's why I'm reading the book. But it is so subtle, and it is so seductive. It starts with a legitimate desire. It starts with a little bit too much of my heart and mind given away to something that's not the God of the universe. It starts with making some good, wise choices and seeing how God blesses those choices, and then thinking, maybe I'm starting to get this thing figured out. That's why we need 9 chapters to remind us that this is a real danger to us. I want to finish up just by looking at chapter 9 a little bit more. We don't have time to go verse by verse. But chapter 9 is the conclusion of the prologue, and it's laid out in an interesting structure. The first 6 verses, verses 1 through 6, is the Lady Wisdom. She's at a house on a hill, calling all the simple, all the people who need wisdom, to come to her and enjoy a banquet at her house, and she calls to them. The last 6 verses of the chapter, verses 13 through 18, is the Lady Folly, the unfaithful wife, boisterous, standing outside her house on a hill, calling the simple to come and enjoy a meal at her house. Stolen water is sweet, the bread eaten in secret is pleasant. And the hinge between that are 6 verses that kind of seem out of place at first glance. Verses 7 through 12, we're going to look at them in groups of 3 of chapter 9. Proverbs 9, 7 through 9 reads this way: he who corrects a scoffer gets dishonor for himself, and he who reproves a wicked man gets insults for himself. Do not reprove a scoffer, or he will hate you. Reprove a wise man, and he will love you. Give instruction to a wise man, and he will be still wiser. Teach a righteous man, and he will increase his learning. Now, I don't know about you, but when I read those verses, my initial way of reading them is that somebody is telling me, somebody who's wise and knowledgeable, who I should bother to correct and who I shouldn't bother to correct. Don't bother to correct a scoffer. Do correct a wise man. I think that's the wrong way to read these verses. Who is it that gives dishonor when you correct a scoffer? Not God, surely. God commands us to correct those who are in error. No, it's the scoffer who's going to dishonor you. It's the scoffer who's going to insult you. A scoffer, by the way, is a fool who is entrenched in his folly. I don't think the question is, who should I correct? I think the question we should be asking when we look at these verses is, how do I respond to correction? How I respond to correction is going to tell me which category I fall into. Do I get angry when somebody corrects me, when somebody points out that I'm wrong, when somebody says I'm not doing it right? Do I want to instinctively attack them, dishonor them, discredit them? Or do I look at it as an opportunity to learn and to grow wiser? By the way, this doesn't mean that everybody who corrects you is always right. But regardless of whether they're right or not, your attitude reveals which category you fall into. If you prayerfully consider their correction and say, yeah, actually, I think they're wrong this time, you still are growing in wisdom, aren't you? But even if they're wrong, if your instinctive reaction is to tear them down because they had the temerity to criticize you, you are not on the path of wisdom, my friend. Verses 10 through 12. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. We've heard that before. It's your relationship with God that holds all of this together. A right attitude toward God is essential to obtaining godly wisdom. And then verses 11 through 12 say, for by me your days will be multiplied and years of life will be added to you. If you are wise for yourself, and if you scoff, you alone will bear it. That just means by me, that's relationship with God. You're going to have life, again, physical and spiritual meaning there, double meaning there. If you're wise, you're going to reap the benefits. If you're a scoffer, you're going to suffer the consequences. But at the heart of that, what it comes down to is your relationship with God, your attitude toward God. Your reaction to criticism, your reaction to correction, and he's about to launch in to 22 chapters of good advice. How you respond to that reveals your heart toward God. See, everywhere that folly appeals to us in a way that separates us from a proper relationship with God, from a dependent relationship with God. Folly appeals to our desires, saying, don't look to God to meet those desires. I've got a quicker way. I've got a better way. I've got a more fun way to meet those desires. Folly wants to capture our hearts, our imagination. Don't focus on the Creator God and allow Him to capture your heart. Look at this shiny trinket. Think about this. Give me your attention. Folly says, you've got it figured out. Look at all your successes. Look at your track record. You're now the wise person. You're now the one that gets to correct others. Other people shouldn't be correcting you. You see how easy it is to slip down that road. So if we want to protect against it, we need to secure our relationship with God in these areas. We need to allow our desires to draw us toward God, the one who can meet them legitimately. We need to allow God to capture our hearts and minds and imaginations. And we need to constantly recognize that dependence on God is the only source of true wisdom. That is how we avoid the appeal of folly. We avoid folly by trusting God to meet our desires, allowing Him to capture our hearts, and cultivating an ongoing dependence on Him. It comes back to our relationship with God. Wisdom requires it, and folly will always pull us away from that right relationship with God. But if we want to resist the temptation of folly, we need to trust God to meet our desires, allow him to capture our hearts, and cultivate our dependence on him. So how are we doing in that area, guys? What legitimate desire am I tempted to meet in an illegitimate way? I can acknowledge that the desire is real and okay, and maybe even a godly desire. But that doesn't mean it's okay for me to decide how to meet that desire. I need to submit that desire to God. What is it that's capturing my heart and mind on a daily basis? When my mind wanders, when I dream, when I think about the things that make my heart flutter, is it God? Is it the things of God? Or is it something else? And finally, how am I cultivating an ongoing sense of dependence on God? He is the true source of wisdom. This one's tricky, guys, because the fact is, as we grow in wisdom, we do grow in wisdom. We do become wiser, and God wants us to use that wisdom. But the moment we become satisfied with that, we slip back on to the road of folly. So it takes work, it takes effort to remind ourselves, to humble ourselves continually and recognize that though I may know more than I did a year ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, compared to God, I don't know anything. How am I cultivating that dependence so I don't become wise in my own eyes? Let's pray. God, we thank you.